So very briefly, I want to introduce Amir, and I know many of you have been here over the last couple of days and have heard him in the Lenten lectures. Many others of you have read his book, Oil and Water. Some of you I know have shared with me that several years ago you heard him at Naramata. So we have a lot of people that know you. He has promised yesterday that he's going to give the best sermon that he's ever preached in this church today. At one brief moment he warned it could be the worst, but then he went back to saying it will be the best. It has been such a joy to have Amir with us, to share his profound faith, to share with us his vast experience, not only of his own Muslim faith, but also of a variety of faiths and a variety of cultures around the world. He teaches theology. I love this. He's a Canadian who lives in the U.S., so I relate to that. He is a Muslim who teaches theology at a Roman Catholic university. I like that too. He brings wonderful experience, he brings his faith, and he speaks from his heart. And I am so pleased to welcome to our pulpit this morning, Amir Hussain.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Donald and to Kevin for hosting me. Burl's back there with the kids. Burl's been really helpful in making me feel at home here. Thanks to Carl, who's doing the sound, so I sound wonderful. Thanks to the musicians. The music is always a blessing. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm always reluctant when ministers ask me to give a sermon, because it usually means, they've been getting some complaints from their congregation, and they typically will say, "Oh, you think I'm not good at sermons? Wait till you hear this guy. You'll be back next week." "Oh, thank you. Thanks that you're here." So I'm sure this is part of the hidden agenda here. Donald said that, I teach at Loyola Marymount University, which is the Jesuit university in Los Angeles, and I find myself, having taught there for a dozen years, of making 3 points when I speak, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I gather 3 is an important number for Christians, so somehow that's, come into my talking, so sort of, 3 points here. And Donald said the sermon's usually about an hour and a half or so just, sort of bear with me here. The text that we started with, the Jeremiah text, is this really interesting text about covenant. The days are coming, the text begins, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. Those of you that know about Judaism know the importance of that word, covenant, contract. Really relationship. It's one of the key words for Jews. That word, berit, in Hebrew. 270 times it's there in the text of the Hebrew Bible. But it's only there once in this form. Berit hadashah, new covenant. This is the only time that phrase, new covenant, appears in the Hebrew Bible, in that text of Jeremiah. And for me, that covenant contract is really about relationship. How are we in relationship to each other? How do we treat each other? How do we treat our neighbors? And that's really the first point that I want to make. It's all about relationships. It's all about neighbors. I had the great privilege at the University of Toronto of being mentored by the great Canadian scholar of religion, a man named Wilfred Cantwell-Smith. Wilfred was phenomenal teacher. He and his wife Muriel had retired back to Toronto, which was their home. He was actually a United Church minister. He and Muriel were at Bloor Street United in Toronto. Extraordinary person. And I'm, in many ways, I see myself as progressive on sorts of some things, but traditionalist in other ways. You want to know what I know? Ask me who my teachers are. All I do is sing their songs. Wilfred was, as I said, extraordinary. And there's a moment, and I write about this in Oil and Water, where someone in class once very famously asked him, "Professor Smith, are you Christian?" And it was an interesting question, are you Christian? If it was, are you a Christian? His answer would have been a simple yes. In fact, I'm a minister in the United Church of Canada. But it wasn't, are you a Christian? It was, are you Christian? The adjective. Wilford did what Wilford always did when someone asked him a question. He took it seriously. He thought about it. He repeated it. Am I Christian? And he answered, maybe I was. Last Tuesday, at lunch, for about an hour. But if you really want to know, ask my neighbor. I love that. Am I Christian? Ask my neighbor. How do I behave? How am I in relationship? Do I know my neighbor? Do I take care of my neighbor? For me, that's really what this text from Jeremiah is talking about. What is this new covenant? This is the covenant, Jeremiah says, I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. I will write it on their hearts. That's a second point that I want to make here. The importance of the heart. It's not just a seat of emotion for us, because now we think of, the head as the intellectual place and the heart as the emotional place. That wasn't what it always was. It used to be the heart wasn't just the seat of emotion, but the heart was also the seat of intellect. The heart was what was important. Wilford, my teacher, talked about faith and the difference between belief and faith. I won't go into that because that literally will take an hour to go into the distinctions there. But Wilford talked about faith, and for Muslims, the translation is iman. Deeper than actions. Islam, and we talked about this, and it was a privilege to be here with folks for the Lenten Lecture Series. We talked about this during the series, that Islam literally means surrender, submission. A Muslim is one who makes that surrender. And it's really about actions. Muslims talk about the 5 pillars. The faith statement, no God but God, Muhammad is messenger of God. Prayer, charity, fasting during the month of fasting, pilgrimage once in your life to Mecca if you're able to. Those are the actions that Muslims are to do. But there's a deeper level than Islam, because Islam literally surrender. A Muslim, one who makes that surrender to God. But there's a deeper level, and that in Arabic is iman, faith. And there's a difference here, and that's expressed in a beautiful line, 2 lines actually from the Quran. This is chapter 49 of the Quran, verses 13 and 14, where God speaks and says, O humanity, ya ayyuhan nas is how it begins, O humankind. Indeed, we, sometimes God speaks in the plural, indeed we, God, have created you for male and female, and made you into peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most pious. And the Arabic word is interesting. The one that has the most taqwa, the most piety. I'll say more about that in a second. The most noble of you in the sight of God is the most pious of you. Indeed, God is knowing, aware. That's verse 13. Verse 14 of that same chapter, chapter 49, continues where a group of Bedouin come to the prophet. The Bedouins say, we have faith. We have iman, this deeper knowledge, this deeper level. The Quran says to the Prophet Muhammad, say, you have not faith, but say you have submitted, you have Islam, because faith has not yet entered your hearts. There's that is again. Faith has not yet entered your hearts. That's the key. Do you have faith? Is it here in the heart, not just here intellectually? Is it there in the heart? Do you act in particular ways? This, for Muslims, is what distinguishes people from each other. That's what makes a person better than another person. Not if they're a Muslim, not if they're a Christian. Muslims by definition aren't better than other people. It's do you A, have faith, and B, that word taqwa that I used, that the Quran uses. Piety. Do you have that awareness of God? Do you act in certain ways, and that connects to the gospel text that Donald read. That's my favorite gospel text. Mark is probably my favorite gospel, but as a particular passage, this passage in Matthew, the parable of the great banquet, probably my favorite passage in the New Testament. I spoke at the Lenten lecture series about my friend Jack Miles. Jack is this phenomenal writer whose first book, God, a biography, won him a Pulitzer Prize. His second book, Christ, A Crisis in the Life of God, won him a MacArthur Genius Grant. So, phenomenal writer. Jack's got a new book that'll be coming out this fall on the Quran. He's a biblical scholar. How do you introduce the Quran to people? And so I would recommend that book for folks interested in the Quran, coming out in the fall. But it was Jack who mentioned to me that in the Matthew text that Donald read, the you, when Jesus speaks of the you, the original text of that document is in Greek. The you in the Greek text is the plural you, not the singular you. We don't make that distinction in English between you one person, and you collective. We make that distinction in some forms of English, y'all and all y'all. And I've been told, and I've spent enough time in the South, that they tell me that y'all is actually singular. All y'all is the correct plural use, But that's this text. It's all y'all. It's the plural. It's the you. It's not speaking to the individual Christian. It's speaking to the collective. It's a plural, the body of believers. I say to my students all the time, the church is not a what. The church is a who. The proper question to ask is not what is the church. The proper question to ask is who is the church. The church is not this magnificent building in which we worship. The church is you. The church is us. The church is us who come together to gather, to worship. For Muslims, same idea. We use the word ummah. Literally a mother, coming from the same mother, that we're all of the same community, all of the same family. That's the key. Do we have that community? And that's the third and last point that I want to make. Do we have that community? Do we act as a community, not as individuals? That's the power of that text from Matthew 25. Where Jesus says, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. Sick, and you visited me. In prison, and you came to me. As Donald read, then the righteous will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? As you did it, Jesus answers, to the least of these, you did it to me. I'm in church, and I always have to confess when I'm in church, and in all seriousness, I have to confess the terror that I sometimes feel when I read those words. And think, do I do this? I give to the food bank, but do I really help the hungry? Do I really clothe the naked? Do I visit my friends in the hospital? Do I visit those in prison? I live in the United States, the country that incarcerates the most people, not just per capita, but overall. We have over 2 million Americans who are in prison. Do we pay attention to them? Do we visit them? Do we take care of them? And I'm terrified that I don't live up to this ideal. Do I do these kinds of things? Not really. Can I be better at them? Absolutely. That's what, for me, is the calling. This, I'm convinced, is the new covenant that the prophet Jeremiah is talking about. A world in which we see ourselves in relationship with each other. Take care of each other. Because this is what God has put in our hearts. Our connections to and with each other. Thank you.